my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Before we get into this episode, I just got to ask you guys a quick question. How did you all enjoy losing your 1 hour of sleep this weekend? At least those of you who are in the United States and live in a state that actually follows daylight savings time, since I believe Hawaii and I think Arizona, I want to say, don't follow it. And then if you're in some other part of the world, I have no idea what your daylight savings schedule is or if you even follow it. But yeah, lost an hour of sleep this weekend, which, not gonna lie, was kind of rough. But with that said, I am enjoying the fact that it's light and longer. So at the time I'm recording this podcast, I record it usually in the evenings. It's actually light outside, at least when I'm starting to record the episode. By the time I finish, it'll probably be dark, but you know, it is what it is. It is a little bit rough, now that when I have to wake up for work in the morning, it's dark again. It was just kind of starting to get a little bit light out when I had to get up, and it's dark again. So that's kind of rough, but you know, it is what it is. It'll slowly start getting better. But yeah, daylight savings time, gotta love that time of year. But let's start off this episode with this week's trivia question. So this week's trivia question, honestly, I think it's going to stump a lot of people. So big props to anyone who gets this week's trivia question correct. But this week's trivia question is, what was Linus Torvalds' original name for his operating system? And I'll give you a hint. If you're thinking Linux, that's the current name, but that's not right. So go back to the drawing board. So that is your trivia question for the week. Now, before we get too far into this episode, I need to make a public service announcement. So for anyone out there that has a Nintendo 3DS or a Wii U, the Nintendo eShop for those devices is closing on March 27th, which means you won't be able to download any apps or anything like that from the eShop after the 27th, which is about less than 2 weeks away. We're getting close to that point. Let's see. So I'm recording this. Yeah, it's about a week and a half away from the day that this episode airs. So anyone out there that has a 3DS or a Wii U lying around, make sure that if there's anything you want, you get it, because you won't be able to get it again. And the reason why I bring this up is because if you're like me and you enjoy playing Pokemon, if you want to be able to transfer Pokemon from your old games to the latest games, you have to go through the 3DS to get your Pokemon in Pokemon Bank and then up to Pokemon Home. The problem is Pokemon Bank is a download from the eShop. So if you don't download it before the 27th, you're never going to be able to download it, which means you'll never be able to transfer any old Pokemon up to the latest games, which would definitely be a major bummer. Theoretically, Nintendo might port some of the games to the newer gen consoles, like they did with Gens 1 and 2. They made virtual consoles on the 3DS, which also are through the eShop. So if you want to play the original games on the 3DS or transfer original Gen 1 and Gen 2 Pokemon to the latest games, you have to get them, basically get them now, before they go bye-bye forever. Because they did like a complete, Nintendo did like or I guess Game Freak did like a complete redesign on the back end of how Pokemon are, I guess, structured between Gens 1 and 2 and then Gen 3 and onward. So while you're able to transfer Pokemon from Generation 1 to Generation 2 on the original cartridges, no problem, you can't transfer them up to Generation 3, which was a huge controversy back in the day. But I guess there's a little caveat to that. There is a video I saw floating around on YouTube of someone that actually did manage to reverse engineer and make it possible to transfer from Generation 2 up to Generation 3. Little janky, not like mass market by any stretch of the imagination, at least by the time I'm recording this. And there is a little bit of guesswork and kind of hacking involved to like actually get it to work, but he did get it to work. But for everyone else, yeah, if your Pokemon are on a Gen 1 or Gen 2 cartridge, they're not getting past that stage. But now, if you don't get Pokemon Bank and the Poke Transporter, which you have to get through Pokemon Bank, which it's really weird because the Poke Transporter is on the eShop, but you can't download it from the eShop unless you have Pokemon Bank and download the Poke Transporter through Pokemon Bank, which takes you to the eShop to download it. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's kind of weird and complicated and convoluted. I'm not sure why they did it that way, but that's how they did it. But anyway, if you don't download those to your 3DS, you won't be able to do any kind of transferring upwards unless you find a 3DS on eBay somewhere, someone reselling it that happens to already have them installed. And maybe someone somewhere down the line will find a way to sideload them on there. I don't know, but it's safe to just get them now because well, for my understanding anyway, is, well, before this shutdown happens, you had to pay for Pokemon Bank to be able to store Pokemon in there and transfer them to the new games. But my understanding is once the eShop shuts down, basically Nintendo's going to make it free for everyone, so you don't need to pay for it anymore. And the app, I believe, is free to download, from what I recall. But I believe to get the Poke Transporter, don't quote me on this, but I think you might actually have to have the paid subscription to be able to actually go through and download it if you haven't done it already. I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's like $5 for the year. So, I mean, it's essentially a $5 purchase for 2 apps, and then you'll be able to transfer your Pokemon up for as long as you want, basically, unless they shut down servers who knows how many years down the road, but that, we'll get there if we get there. But yeah, it's kind of crazy to think that the 3DS has been around for over a decade now, since 2011, which kind of makes me feel old since I remember getting a 3DS, and man, it does not feel like over a decade ago, let me tell you. But yeah, so yeah, that's your public service announcement for anyone with an old 3DS or Wii U out there, or yeah, Wii U out there. If there's anything you want, now's the time to get it, because it's going to be shutting down soon. So with that out of the way, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, the big thing that I want to hit on here is to avoid single points of failure. Now, for the general home user, general casual user, this probably isn't a huge issue for you, because you probably don't have services running that you need to rely on. But maybe it's, you have your main computer and then a backup computer. If something happens to one of those computers, you're not out a computer maybe. But specifically for the home labbers amongst us, single points of failure are definitely something that we have to be aware of. And anyone in the enterprise world knows that single points of failure are a huge concern, because the reason why you don't want to have single points of failure, if it's not obvious enough, if that one point of failure fails, you're out of luck. And if that's a critical service or server or router or switch or something, and it goes down, you could be in a world of hurt. So, for example, let's say you have a NAS set up somewhere, and you don't have any backups for the NAS, you don't have any redundancy for the NAS, nothing. If some cyber attacker gets in, ransomwares your NAS, corrupts everything, encrypts everything, and all your data's gone, well, you don't have a backup, and you don't have any other systems where the NAS was replicated to. You have no means to get the data back, so you're kind of out of luck. Unless you want to pay the cyber criminal, but don't do that if you can avoid it, because that just promotes their behavior. Now, in addition to that NAS example, let's assume that maybe you're playing around, with a router. Maybe you're, like in my case, we all know about my router saga, which actually I have an update for you this episode, which we'll get into. But say you're playing around with a router and that goes down. If you don't have some other router or some other means to connect to the internet, well, again, you're out of luck. No internet for you. Which, a little bit of a side tangent, part of the reason why I don't necessarily catch when my router misbehaves, I guess we can say, is because I don't have a single point of failure, because I have two separate networks, one for like my servers and then one for my other devices, and like things like my phone, my TV, and like a couple of my laptops and such are on that other network. So if I'm using them, I have no idea if the router is down, which sometimes it is, so I don't know. But then if I'm on the other network, my server network, then yeah, I can tell pretty quickly that it's down. But the nice thing is just because that one router goes down, that doesn't mean I'm completely out of internet. So there's a real-world example of avoiding single points of failure. Another one would be like DNS stuff. So at my house, I host a few DNS servers, again, for basically the same purpose, avoiding single points of failure, partly in case if a VM fails, partly to load balance. But another reason why I had that was I have essentially a DNS server, a Pi-hole server is what I'm running on different hypervisors. So if I want to take a hypervisor down for maintenance, again, no single point of failure. So even though that one DNS server is down, I still have others that are running, so I don't lose access to the internet. So things like that, it basically increases your resiliency, so you can afford to take things down for maintenance to prevent any future issues. And in the events of some kind of cyber attack or some other kind of hacking going on, or system program crash, whatever the case may be, if a service fails or an appliance fails or a server fails or whatever fails, or for some reason is unusable, you're not out of luck. You still have options, you still have stuff that's usable until you can recover that piece of software, server, appliance, whatever the case may be. So if you can avoid single points of failure, I know there's some places that's kind of hard to do, and in other places that's pretty expensive to do. But where you can, if you can avoid single points of failure at any place you can, you want to make sure you do that. Because, for example, one place that's, like I mentioned, it's costly to do is specifically when we're talking about a NAS or a network attached storage, any kind of backup solution that you might have. The problem there is it doesn't matter how beefy and ballin' of a NAS you got. You essentially have to double your cost if you want to have any kind of redundancy. Because, yeah, it might be cool to have, I don't know, like 100 terabytes worth of raw storage, but if you have no way to back up that 100 terabytes of raw storage and it goes bye-bye, well, then you're out of luck. So you need another 100 terabytes of storage somewhere, whether that's off-site, preferably off-site, whether that's in the cloud, at a friend's house, at your parents' house. I don't know where else you might store some I don't know, anywhere. Not where you are. But I mean, that's in itself, double the price because you have to factor in that extra storage. Now the cheaper solution, if you don't have that massive amount of storage, what you could do is you could somehow like archive your data, kind of like what I've done. I've mentioned my backup script before. Basically archive your storage somehow, and then you could even, as simply as buying like an external hard drive or something, to take that archive data and put it on the external hard drive, and then you can take that external hard drive and, again, put it somewhere off-site, put it at, maybe, depending on where you work, you might not be able to keep it there, or people might get suspicious if you have it there, but, keeping it at a friend's house, family's house, something like that, where your data can be kept safe. That's probably the cheapest solution. Or if you wanted to go the cloud route, that's also a pretty good solution. Again, could be kind of pricey depending on how much data you're trying to back up. But yeah, wherever you can, avoid single points of failure. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, I bet you guys can't guess who bought an Xserve. No, if you're thinking that it's me, I did not buy another Xserve. Personally, I don't really think I need 2 screaming banshees in my house. Now, I will caveat that, though. If those massive industrial fans that I showed you guys on the podcast, when was that, a couple months ago, roaring away, I mean, if those come back, well, then I might have to get another Xserve to protect the Xserve's pride, so it can have some help to compete and take back the title of loudest thing in my house. Because when those fans were here, yeah, the Xserve, I think, like I mentioned in that episode, was kind of like walking like a dog with the tail between its legs, because how outperformed in the noise department it was just getting beat. It was getting absolutely humiliated. So I might have to buy another one to help the Xserve take back the crown for being the loudest thing in the house. But I don't have those fans back, thankfully, so I don't particularly see myself getting another Xserve anytime soon. But Linus from Linus Tech Tips did buy an Xserve, and I gotta say, Linus, if you're listening, which I know you're probably not, welcome to the club. Although I guess I will say, when I was thinking about this, to talk about this on the podcast, which what's kind of funny is I literally sat down to eat dinner, turned on the YouTubes to watch something while I ate my food, and I saw Linus had a video come out today about an Xserve, and they bought an Xserve and kind of going over some of the features and a little bit of the history and whatnot. And I was like, man, I got to talk about this on the podcast. But then as I was, jotting down some notes of things I wanted to mention for this, when I thought about that point of, Linus, if you're listening, which I know you're probably not, I figured, you know what, I might as well check the analytics. And sure enough, there is I think less than 1% of listeners from Canada. And the only percentage of people from Canada that it shows are from British Columbia, which is where Linus's headquarters. So I don't know, maybe Linus is listening to this podcast, which if you are listening, Linus should have hit me up on that video because I saw you had quite the bear of a time trying to get macOS installed, which, I'm not sure if any of you guys saw the video or not, but they walked through all the hoops they were trying to jump through to get macOS installed. And as they were going through this, I was just thinking to myself, man, if only there was a guide somewhere that walked you through how to install macOS on an Xserve, get the server utils, get IPMI working, links to all those resources in one place, how to even run the latest version of macOS. If only there was a guide like that somewhere. Or if someone made a tutorial or a blog post or did any kind of podcast or something discussing it at length on multiple occasions. Man, if only that if only someone did that. Well, oh well, maybe next time, Linus. Maybe next time when you try to buy another Xserve, if you do, maybe there will be one of those things out in the ether that you could reference. But all I'm saying is if any of the devoted listeners to the Dark Assassins podcast was in Linus's shoes, they probably wouldn't have had much issue at all trying to get their Xserve up and running and getting macOS installed. That is for sure. But enough talking about what Linus did this week. Let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I mentioned earlier in the episode, talking about avoiding single points of failure, that I had an update on my router. So router update 394, bonus points for anyone who got the reference there. Of course, I'm referring to the 394 part. It might have been easier for you to have gotten that reference if I used some kind of Alan Rickman impression, but oh well. Anyway, I didn't have any issues this week, surprisingly, but I decided to do some testing and tinkering. So I ran the diagnostic tools that are basically built into every computer's BIOS. So I decided to run the diagnostic tools because part of me was wondering if I was having some kind of hardware issue. I was thinking maybe a RAM issue, possibly a hard drive failing issue. I wasn't sure. I figured might as well run the tests, see what happens. And those tests ran and everything passed. The RAM passed, the smart test for the hard drive passed, and then it ran some other hard drive test and that passed. So I was like, okay, probably not a hardware issue, which on the one hand, that's nice because I don't have to replace anything on the system, but at the same time that doesn't really help me to try to pin down the solution. So I went through the some of this hardware settings, the BIOS settings on the system, and I played around with some of those. Namely, what I did was I changed the power option to full boot rather than quick boot. I honestly don't know if that's even going to help at all. But I figured it's basically running as a server, so even if this full boot takes an extra few seconds, it doesn't really matter to me because, again, it's running as a server. It's not like I need to restart my computer and it needs to be up as fast as possible. And then here though, is where I have some hope. So I was going through some of the settings, and I found two potential options in the power management setting or section. And those were disabling SATA and PCI Express power management. So before they were set to enabled, and now they're set to disabled. And my theory here is that maybe this power management thing is causing the devices to go into or enter some kind of sleep mode, or the power going to them drops enough, and then it causes Proxmox to kind of freak out and freeze and stall and not work anymore. That's kind of what I'm thinking might be happening. And then if I disable the power management features so none of that stuff can happen, maybe that'll prevent these freezes and crashings from happening. I don't know. As of the recording of this podcast, everything is still working. But at the same time, I literally just did this fix yesterday as of the time of recording, so there really hasn't been much time to stress test. And the other problem with this, as those of you who have listened to the podcast for a while now are definitely well aware, I'll come up with a potential fix. It'll be fine for a few days, sometimes even a few weeks or a month or so, and then it decides to break again. So who knows if this is the fix to fix all fixes, or if this is just another fix in the saga of things I'll try before it still decides not to work, and then I'm back to square one. So yeah, I guess hopefully you'll never hear from me again on this issue, because that means this fix actually worked and I kind of forget that I've had any problems with it and we're good to go. Or we continue with this saga and I come back with another update sometime down the road. And yeah, I guess we'll see what happens. Hopefully, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that this is the fix. Now, the other thing that I did this week was, if you remember back I think it was like 2 or 3 episodes ago, I talked about seeing a video tutorial series about building your own operating system. So yeah, I started that. That honestly kind of fun. But this tutorial series goes ham. Now, before I get too far, I do want to give you guys the name of this series, just in case you wanted to look into it yourself and maybe try to make your own operating system too. So I'll also have it linked down in the show notes below too, in case you're interested. But the YouTube channel is called Nanobyte. They have a GitHub repo with like all the source code for the operating system that they're working on through the tutorial. And then they also have like an experimental one where they're kind of doing some experiment stuff on, which I will say, while the tutorial series is very good, at least so far, I think I've gotten through 3 or 4 episodes so far, I think. They do, at one point, he kind of transitions to using like some other compiler, and I didn't feel like installing it, so I kind of spent a decent chunk of time trying to look through, like jumping forward to the part where he switches back to GCC, and then trying to like reverse engineer and hack together getting GCC to work with the current state that I have it at now. And it was quite the process, but it was fun. But there was definitely a lot of tinkering involved to get that working. But that was just a personal preference of mine. If that's something that you don't care about, then it would be even easier for you. But I wanted to try to not have to download a separate tool just for like a couple steps and then going back to GCC. So I figured I might as well try to see if I can't hack in GCC to get it working, which I did end up managing to do, but that did take a decent chunk of time. But one thing that is really interesting about this tutorial series is back in I mentioned in the episode where I talked about building my own operating system and how it's kind of like a pipe dream of mine. And when I was talking about that, I remember I mentioned a operating systems class I took in undergrad where we basically, really all it did was it booted into a kernel and it literally essentially just said hello world basically. And that was literally all it did, and you couldn't shut it down or anything unless you killed the VM or shut your computer off or whatever. But that used the grub bootloader in order to get it to work. Whereas this tutorial series, he has you writing your own bootloader, which is kind of cool if you ask me. Now I'm still in like the super early stages, so like I think I'm at the point now where transitioning from like 16-bit mode to 32-bit mode and trying to incorporate C into the bootloader phase. So definitely, you know, in the grand scheme of an operating system, barely even off the ground, if we even have gotten off the ground, if we've even left the runway, but it definitely progress. Now, I will warn anyone out there that's interested in maybe trying to take this on. While the videos themselves, at least the first few, are kind of in the 25 to 40 minute range as far as runtime goes, don't think that's how long you're going to spend on the video, because you're probably going to be typing stuff along with him. He goes too fast, you have to pause it to make sure you typed it, and then you compile it. When he compiles it, you get an error, you have to go do some debugging, rewind the video. So it's a little deceptive in that sense, where how long the video says it's going to take versus how long you actually take on the video. But then he also gets into some of the later episodes, which I haven't really gotten into, that are like parts of a live stream, and they're like hours long. So if you're interested in undergoing, you know, this project and kind of making your own OS like that, be sure to set a large chunk of time aside, because you're probably going to spend a large chunk of time just working on like one small segment of these, or if it's the live stream, a small segment of it, or if it's one of the pre-done videos, a large segment on just one of those videos. So make sure you have plenty of time, because you will definitely need it. But so far, I've thought it's been pretty fun. I guess we'll see how far I get with this before some other project comes along and takes the wind out of these sails, and it becomes another one of my many personal projects that just kind of gets put on the back burner for a long time before I come back to it months, weeks, years later, whatever the case may be, realize how cool it is, and then get back into it. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, if anyone interested, I'll leave a link down in the show notes for both the playlist on YouTube as well as the GitHub repo, in case you want to check either of those out. So with that out of the way, I wanted to get into a couple developer-specific news stories that I kind of came across. One of them is actually from, I think, a couple weeks ago, which we also kind of touched on, I think, a little bit in the episode we did of should you actually be a software developer? And this goes to a study that found nearly 40% of software engineers will only work remotely, which I found, honestly, it's not surprising, to be honest, with how us software devs are. It's not exactly something that's super shocking, but it at the same time, like 40% of, software engineers and developers only wanting to work remotely, is kind of interesting. And the thing is like, some people are reportedly planning on quitting, like, if their organization makes them go back to the office, or they won't work for a new company if they don't have the option to work from home or work remotely. Now, I think I mentioned it in that episode where we talked about, the pros and cons of being a software developer, like as your profession. And I am very much mixed when it comes to working remotely and working from home, because on the one hand, I do enjoy it. The commute is awesome. I'll take 7 steps for my commute any day of the week. It is amazing. But on the other hand, it's depending on the work that you do and the projects you develop for, it's honestly kind of an impediment to your productivity to work from home. And the reason I say that is, I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in the episode a few weeks ago. While it's nice to, be able to work from home, you don't necessarily have to get dressed at all if you don't want to, unless you have, some kind of meetings or something, but you could either not turn your camera on, or you can do what I did when I was doing job interviews and only dress from the waist up and don't worry about anything on the waist down. Just wear what you want to wear because no one's going to see it anyway. Just make sure you don't stand up while your camera's still on, since that would not be good. But the thing is, depending on what projects you're working on, nothing beats being able to walk down the hall or go to the next cube over, or essentially within the matter of seconds be able to just in person, like, ask one of the other developers, like, hey, I have a question for you. Can you help me with X, Y, and Z? Or, hey, can you look over my code real quick? Or something like that you can get an immediate response. Now, you could say, well, if you're working remotely, you could try to, set up just a one-on-one, like, session between you and another developer and kind of do a screen share thing, which I guess, yeah, that could kind of work. Or you could say, well, yeah, you could, shoot them a Slack message or shoot them a Teams message or whatever message thing you're using. Yeah, I guess you could do that, but something, in my opinion, that there's something that you don't really get when you're, have that in-person interaction, which, because for me personally, like, even the whole, like, video conference thing to kind of, like, screen share and look over the code, while, yeah, that could be a replacement, you still kind of have to schedule the time, and you have to make sure that the other person's, like, actively looking at their messages, because if you haven't been around developers much, one thing that can happen to us is we'll just get so sucked into our code that we'll kind of neglect, for lack of a better term, like, anything else. So I've had it happen where I'll just be busy, focusing on coding, doing my development stuff, and then I'll be like, oh yeah, I should probably, just check up on my email and, Teams messages, make sure I didn't miss anything. And of course I did miss something. So if it's that kind of situation, you're not going to have as quick of a response as if, you just walk down the hall or walk to the next cube over and, ask the person, like, hey, can you help me with this? And now, if you're working on, some kind of open source framework or something where there's tons and tons of documentation online, you're working in a super widely known language, like if you're a web developer working with JavaScript, doing Java development, Python, C++, Rust, any of those widely known languages, and you're using, open source frameworks or widely used frameworks, that kind of thing, with lots and lots of good documentation out there, then yeah, you probably don't necessarily need to have to, you probably won't necessarily have a lot of questions that you can't just, open up your web browser and, search to your heart's content and find your answer relatively quickly. Now, some would argue, yeah, well, you could still probably get the answer quicker if you went and talked to someone. Okay, yeah, sure. But I'm trying to be the middleman here and, argue both sides and try to see both sides of the argument and not go all in on one camp and ignore the other one. So there are definitely, without a doubt, pros and cons to working remotely versus, working in the office all the time. And on the other hand, though, I guess if you're working, say your company, say you're working at you're working at Meta or Google or Apple or any other tech company, and you have your own proprietary frameworks that you can't just, go online and search documentation for. In those cases, you can't, like I mentioned, you can't just go online and look up how do I do X, Y, and Z in this framework because the documentation does not exist because it's not publicly available. Now, maybe your company has a super good documentation scheme that you can easily search and find the answers that way. If you're in that boat, that's awesome. But not every company has that. And if you're in one of those situations, then you really have no choice. Here's your choices. You can either sit there at your computer and beat your head against the wall for hours and days on end, or you could just go ask one of the other developers a quick question, and they could either, if they don't know the answer, they can point you in the right direction of the answer to help you along. So it really depends in that regard as far as what your workflow is and like what kind of projects you're working on. Because on the one hand, yes, you could just be as efficient at home as you would be at the office, because if you have any questions, you can easily look things up and get your answers. But on the other hand, you potentially couldn't have that luxury, in which case being in the office and being able to have that interaction with other developers that have also had experience in this proprietary framework to get their input and their insights on what you should do to fix your problem, overcome a bug, where to find a solution, that kind of thing. That's where it becomes invaluable to actually have that in office time. So as far as like wanting to only work remotely, I don't know. I think it'd be kind of cool to only work remotely, but at the same time, like I mentioned, it would probably get tough at times. Like even if things were, even if the framework you were working on was like completely open, that would be kind of hard at times. Sometimes you just want to like ask someone a question and just get a quick answer. So I think for me personally, I definitely wouldn't say no. If the company, if I want to go, work for a company and they said no remote work at all, that wouldn't necessarily be a deal breaker for me. Just because a company said, I can be 100% remote means that I would rank that job higher than another job that I couldn't be 100% remote. I think you definitely have to find a balance between the two. Now, obviously, one thing that can't be understated is the fact that, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this, at least my instance right now, where I kind of have like a hybrid, part working from home, part working in the office, my 7-step commute on my work from home days are amazing. That cannot be understated. Now, the other story that I wanted to talk about here, which is kind of rustling some feathers, I guess, in the open source community, is Docker, specifically Docker Hub, is going to be removing open source organizations from Docker Hub unless they pay their yearly or monthly subscription or whatever. And yeah, it's not sitting well with a lot of people. So Docker Hub, I guess, sent out an email they sent out an email to anyone, I guess, registered as an organization, telling them that their account will be deleted, including all images, if they do not upgrade to a paid team plan. So yeah, basically, if you were registered as an organization and you didn't pay, you were just a free member, they're, I guess, going to delete all of they're going to delete your organization and any images you had hosted on Docker Hub. So yeah, and the plan isn't exactly cheap. It's $420 a year, and I guess it's paid monthly. So I guess you could potentially argue that's a little less of a pain, but still, that's a nice chunk of change, especially if your quote-unquote organization is just you or maybe like a small team. Because one thing you have to remember here, the part of the point of open source development is like the free aspect of it. And when you're dealing with free software, you don't necessarily have a stream of income coming in, or at least a stream of reliable income coming in, because you're basically, your main income stream is focused on donations from people generous enough to donate money to you because they really enjoy using your product and want to support you. But there's also a lot of people that, they really enjoy using your product, but it's free, so, it's free, so they don't feel like paying you anything because it's free. Which is part of the point of making it free, so you can, get, more people, a bit larger user base, and more people using it. So forcing, these open source developers to pay, to be able to host their images on one of the largest places to host Docker images is kind of rough. But from what I understand from this article, which I'll have linked in the show notes, it does appear to be that there are some ways around this, I guess, potential removal. Part of it, I believe there's like an open source program, open source in quotes, that you could potentially qualify for. I guess I wouldn't hold your breath on that. But one of the other ones that seems a little bit more reliable is basically completely delete your organization before Docker Hub does, and then recreate a personal account, which you can make as a free account, and then essentially repost all of your Docker images under your free account. And I guess another reason you might want to do this is potentially prevent some cyber attacker from doing it before you do. And because one thing that has been, I don't know how big of an issue it's been with Docker Hub and like Docker images in general, but cyber attackers essentially pooling Docker images, adding like malicious code into the Docker images and trying to publish them as, the same Docker images. So people would essentially pool malicious Docker images rather than the actual good ones, which, like any open source project, if you want to make sure that your, Docker images are clean and there's no shenanigans going on in them, build them yourself and look through the source code, make sure everything's good and as it should be and there's nothing funky going on in there. And then another, I guess, solution was start pushing Docker images to GitHub. GitHub has their own container registry that you can push to, which I believe some people already do. I mean, just having your images in multiple places, even more exposure. Plus, if you're going to be hosting, your source code repo with the code that builds the Docker image. I mean, having it all in one place potentially could be, maybe even a more streamlined solution. I'm not sure. I haven't posted any images to either Docker Hub. I don't have an account on Docker Hub, or I haven't posted any images on GitHub's container registry either. I have made my own Docker images before, as I've mentioned on the podcast, but I haven't published them anywhere. If you want to use any of the Docker images I've made, you basically have to download my source code and run the Docker file, which I have steps on how to do that in the README. It's pretty simple. So yeah, this was a the thing that I think will be most interesting about this is what's going to happen, because when you use Docker, I haven't played around with Docker enough to know, if you can necessarily specify where you're pulling your images from, your base images that you want to use to build your container off of. But that could potentially hurt some people's workflows if they were trying to pull something from Docker Hub and then that image is no longer available because either the organization got deleted by Docker Hub or it got rebranded over to something else because someone removed the organization and recreated it under their own name. So having to try to migrate your workflows to account for this potential deletion of organizations could potentially cause some bumps and some hiccups, but I guess we'll see what happens. Definitely, not necessarily a great move from the PR looks department, because I think a lot of open source developers and just developers in general that use Docker aren't exactly too pleased with this move. But at the end of the day, Docker Hub, at the end of the day, they got to make money. Hosting all these images, it's not free, right? You can't, if you deal with any kind of hosting or storage of data, or even storage of physical items like property or anything like that, it ain't free. There is costs involved of storing this, whether in in this realm with, software and data, it's the hard drives, the SSDs, the servers, the RAM, the electricity, all that stuff to run the infrastructure, to keep the data, all of the systems in place to make sure there's redundancy so you don't lose people's data, you have backups in place, all this stuff costs money. So to offer it for free, you gotta somehow make money somewhere. So it seems like maybe they're kind of a lot of places they're going with the old subscription model, and then I guess they weren't making enough money, so now they're trying to force the subscriptions onto people. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but what's one more subscription, right? Soon enough, everything will be a subscription. It seems like that's the way that companies seem to want to go, which to their credit, it's a lot nicer to know that you're always going to have a steady stream of income coming in, rather than, one-time purchases for stuff, because then you can have massive fluctuations in, revenue streams. Whereas if you're always having a constant subscription, you always know you're getting that, $9 a month from everyone, or that $10 a month, or $20, or whatever the subscription is. You always know you're getting that constant stream of revenue, which is, from the business aspect of it, a nice thing to have. From the consumer aspect, on the other hand, it's kind of annoying having all these subscriptions all the time, especially when it's deceiving just how quickly these subscriptions can add up when you consider oh yeah, it's only $5 a month, and then you multiply that by a few subscriptions, and the next thing you know, you're paying a lot of money. And then not every month, but then not to mention on top of that, while it might seem appealing, whatever their subscription plan is for a given month, you have to multiply that by 12 to actually get what you're paying every year. And at that point, you can multiply that number by X number of years, and you can realize you're really getting taken for a ride on how much this software costs, or product or service, or whatever the case may be. Whereas before, you could have, if it's at least in like the software realm, you could have just paid a one-time fee and would have been done. Where I guess you could argue, on the other hand, with the subscription model, you're always getting constant releases and constant updates, so trying to put a price tag on that versus buying a license for some software product like, say, the Adobe Suite, for example, or Windows or Microsoft Office, or some other, license thing that used to come out every few years, and then having to repay that license every few years. You could potentially make the argument that the subscription is the same thing, just rather than paying one large sum once every few years, you're just paying a smaller amount every few months, and you're always getting updates and whatnot. But on the other hand, you could also argue that maybe you don't want all those latest updates, or maybe they changed something you don't like and you like the older version. If you just paid the one-time fee on that license for that one product, that product is basically yours. You can, use it as long as you want, and you're good to go. And yeah, that's another whole topic with, the subscriptions. Do you really own the software? Especially if once you stop paying the subscription, you lose access to use it, like the Adobe Suite. So yeah, that is on. So when it comes to open source software, that is one thing that's really nice about it, because you don't have to pay for it, and you actually own the software because all the source code's right there. You can download it, you can make changes to it, you can do whatever the heck you want with it, and it is free and open for everyone to use. But on the other hand, that does come at a cost. Gotta be supported somewhere. Like I mentioned, this stuff isn't free. So I guess the call to action, I guess, if you will, here, if you do use open source software, and you really enjoy using it, maybe tipping the developer a couple bucks, just to say thank you for the hard work that they put into it. Even if it's a developer team, just give them a couple bucks would definitely help them. Or don't, it's free world. You can do what you want. But yeah, so I don't know. It's kind of sad when, more things, at least in my opinion, with more things moving to subscriptions. Personally, if I'm going to pay for something, I'd rather just pay for it at one time. The whole saying, buy once, cry once, I think is what it is. Yeah, you might not want to pay that large sum, but then you don't have to worry about paying, over a longer period of time. So yeah, that was really rambly. But, we talked about free and open source software a little bit, which is a great tie-in to this week's trivia question. So if you'll recall, this week's trivia question is, what was Linus Torvalds' original name for his operating system? And remember, the hint here was the answer is not Linux. Although the operating system is Linux, that was not his original name for it. So, if you said Freaks, you are correct. And Freaks being spelled Freax. So, this was supposed to be a combination of the word free, Freaks, and X as kind of an allusion to Unix. So the story kind of goes that when he was at going to school, he, I guess on the CS server that they had, or some server that they had, he had put his operating system on there and had called it Freaks, I guess. And then one of the, I don't know if it was like an admin or a professor or someone, they changed the name of it to Linux for Linus's, basically Linus's Unix, and I guess the name stuck, and now we have Linux. So, nice little piece of trivia there for you. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode. So if you enjoyed the episode, I ask that you leave it a rating and review, and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member who you think might enjoy this episode, or even the podcast. I mean, we got a nice backlog now of a lot of episodes, almost a year's worth. Kind of crazy to think that this podcast has been going for almost a year at this point. But if you have any questions about this episode, or you have topics or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. That is also down in the show notes below that you can click on to shoot me an email with any questions you have. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, full nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.